They say justice is blind, but when it falls into the wrong hands, it's no longer a scale of fairness. It becomes a weapon, cutting through the lives of the innocent. At the Metropolitan Police Department, that weapon was wielded with precision. They trained rookies like Ryan Mitchell to see danger where there was none. Ryan, a young and ambitious officer, thought he was upholding the law, but one fateful afternoon, he arrested Darnell Washington, a man whose only crime was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. What Ryan didn't realize was that this single act would bring him face to face with Judge Marcus Carter, a man who turned his own wrongful conviction into a mission to expose police corruption. In Judge Carter's courtroom, justice isn't just blind, it's inevitable. As Ryan's carefully constructed world begins to crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence, he's about to learn a harsh truth. True power doesn't come from a badge. It comes from integrity. Where are you tuning in from today? If this story resonates with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another powerful, thought-provoking story. And trust me, tomorrow's special episode is one you won't want to miss. Ryan Mitchell grew up in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood, the kind where people trusted each other. And the sight of a police cruiser brought a sense of safety. As a boy, he would sit at the dinner table, wide-eyed, listening to his father's stories from his days as a police officer. For Ryan, those stories weren't just about the law. They were about honor, courage, and making a difference in a chaotic world. His father, a man who wore his badge like a second skin, always told him, "Son, this badge isn't just metal. It's a symbol of strength and respect. Earn it. Don't ever let it lose its meaning." Those words stuck with Ryan. They became his compass, the silent whisper guiding him through every step of his life. By the time he graduated from the academy, Ryan was ready to live up to his father's legacy. Or at least, he thought he was. But stepping into the bustling precinct of the Metropolitan Police Department was nothing like the stories his father used to tell. The halls were filled with officers who carried more than just badges. They carried unspoken rules, whispered warnings, and subtle nudges that told him, "Out here, respect isn't given, it's taken." Ryan didn't question it. Not at first. He was eager to prove himself, to show he was more than just another rookie. He worked harder, walked faster, and listened intently to his superiors. He wanted them to see him as competent, reliable, and tough. Yet, beneath that ambition, there was a young man who still believed in the ideals his father had taught him. He wanted to protect people. He wanted to do good. But in a system where power often overshadowed justice, Ryan would soon discover that ambition could be a double-edged sword. Ryan Mitchell thought he was following the rules, just like he'd been taught. But what he didn't realize was that every action he took rippled into someone else's life. For Darnell Washington, that ripple felt like a tidal wave. Darnell was an ordinary man trying to live an ordinary life. He worked a 9-to-5 office job, paid his bills on time, and went to church every Sunday with his family. If there was a rule to follow, Darnell followed it. He believed that staying on the straight and narrow was enough to keep him safe in a world that often judged him by his appearance. That Thursday afternoon, Darnell stopped by the convenience store like he always did after work. His sister had texted him asking if he could grab some treats for her kids for the weekend. Standing near the store entrance, he scrolled through his phone, double-checking her message. He didn't see the patrol car pulling up. The call had labeled him suspicious. No details. No crime. Just a man, standing still, looking at his phone. To the system, that was enough. When the officer approached, Darnell felt a flicker of unease. The young man's hand hovered near his holster, his voice sharp and demanding. "Sir, hands where I can see them." Darnell blinked, confused. "What? I'm just standing here." His voice was steady, but there was a tightness in his chest he couldn't ignore. "Don't argue. Hands up." The officer's tone didn't soften, and his eyes didn't waver. Darnell knew better than to resist. He raised his hand slowly, his phone slipping into his pocket. He tried to explain. "Look, I'm just waiting for someone. I didn't do anything." But explanations didn't matter. They rarely did. The cold metal of handcuffs snapped around his wrists as he stood helplessly in front of onlookers. He could feel their stares, some curious, some uneasy, but none offering help. Darnell's heart sank. He wasn't just being arrested, he was being judged by everyone around him. This wasn't new. Growing up, he'd learned what it meant to walk through life as a black man. You carry yourself with caution, you follow every rule, smile politely, speak softly, but deep down, you know that none of it guarantees protection. As he was pushed toward the patrol car, Darnell looked over his shoulder at the officer. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice quiet, filled with frustration and disbelief. The officer didn't respond. He didn't even look at him. Sitting in the back seat of the car, Darnell felt the weight of a question he couldn't shake. What more could I have done? He wasn't just a man at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a reflection of a system that saw people like him as threats first and humans second. For Darnell, this moment wasn't just about him. It was about every person who looked like him. Every unspoken fear, every invisible injustice that loomed over their lives. And in that moment, as the patrol car drove away, Darnell realized this wasn't just another arrest. It was a reminder of a painful truth. Sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough. In the Metropolitan Police Department, power wasn't just about the badge, it was about control. Behind closed doors, veteran officers exchanged cryptic remarks that shaped the unspoken rules of the system. Out here, respect isn't handed out, you take it. Sometimes, you've got to bend the rules to keep things in check. We don't ask questions, we act first. That's how you stay on top. Ryan Mitchell heard these words every day, slipping into the conversations like background noise. At first, they didn't mean much to him, but over time, they began to shape the way he thought. These weren't just casual comments, they were lessons. Lessons about how the streets worked, and more importantly, how to survive in them. One afternoon in the break room, Sergeant Thompson leaned against the counter, stirring his coffee as if he had all the time in the world. His voice was calm but deliberate. "Mitchell, let me give you some advice. People out there will test you. If you hesitate, you lose. Don't give them a chance to doubt who's in charge." Ryan nodded, absorbing every word. He wanted to impress them, to prove he wasn't just another rookie. And this, he believed, was the way to do it. But something deeper was happening, something Ryan couldn't see. The ambition that once burned to protect and serve was slowly being overshadowed by a hunger for authority. He began to view himself not as a protector of justice but as an enforcer of control. It didn't take long for the lessons to translate into action. One evening, Ryan was dispatched to handle a noise complaint in a neighborhood he didn't know well. As he approached the scene, he remembered Thompson's words, "Act first." Without asking questions, he knocked on the door and spoke firmly, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. The family inside, startled and confused, hurried to comply, even though they hadn't done anything wrong. When Ryan recounted the incident later, the older officers nodded approvingly. One even clapped him on the shoulder. "That's how you do it, Mitchell. Keep it up." Ryan smiled, but there was a flicker of doubt in the back of his mind. He brushed it aside. This was what it meant to belong, wasn't it? He didn't realize that with every lesson he learned, the line between right and wrong grew thinner. The ideals he once held so dearly, fairness, justice, protecting the innocent, were slowly being buried under the weight of a system that demanded obedience over morality. Ryan thought he was earning respect, but the system wasn't giving him respect. It was taking something from him. Piece by piece, it was molding him into the very thing he once thought he'd stand against. And soon, the consequences of those lessons would ripple out in ways he could never have imagined. The call came through as Ryan adjusted his radio, his patrol car idling at the curb. Suspicious activity. Male subject loitering near a convenience store. It was routine, something he'd handled dozens of times during training. But this time, it was different. This time, it was his call. As Ryan pulled up to the store, his heart quickened. There he was, a man standing by the entrance, scrolling through his phone. Business casual, well-dressed, nothing out of place. But Ryan didn't see that. His mind replayed the words of his mentors. Don't hesitate. Take control. He stepped out of the car, straightened his uniform, and approached the man with deliberate steps. "Sir, put your hands where I can see them," Ryan called out, his voice firm. The man, Darnell Washington, looked up, startled. Confusion spread across his face as he raised his hand slightly, his phone still in one. "What's going on?" he asked. "I'm just waiting for someone." Ryan's hand hovered near his holster. He repeated the command, louder this time. "Hands up! Drop the phone!" Darnell complied, his movements slow, cautious. "I haven't done anything," he said, his voice calm but tinged with disbelief. "I'm just standing here." But to Ryan, it didn't matter. Suspicion was enough. He closed the distance, turned Darnell around, and reached for the cuffs. The cold metal snapped around Darnell's wrists as the world around them seemed to freeze. People stopped to watch, some curious, others pulling out their phones. Ryan didn't notice. His focus was on completing the arrest, just as he'd been trained. "Sir, I don't understand," Darnell said, his voice breaking slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong." Ryan didn't respond. He didn't look at Darnell. He didn't even pause to question if this was the right thing to do. He was too caught up in the role he thought he had to play, the enforcer, the authority, the one in control. As he led Darnell toward the patrol car, Ryan felt a brief flicker of something, an unease he couldn't name. But he pushed it aside, telling himself he was just doing his job. And in that moment, as Darnell was placed in the backseat of the car, their lives collided in a way that neither of them could have predicted. Ryan believed he was carrying out his duty. Darnell knew he was facing something far greater than an arrest. For one, it was a routine call. For the other, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The faint click of handcuffs echoed louder than it should have, breaking through the hum of a quiet afternoon. A few passers-by stopped, their curiosity piqued. It started with one or two people glancing over, then more, forming a small crowd outside the convenience store. Someone pulled out their phone, hitting record. The lens captured everything. Darnell, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face etched with confusion. Ryan, standing rigidly, his jaw tight, leading Darnell toward the patrol car without a word. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "What's going on? He didn't do anything." Another voice chimed in. "Why is he being arrested? He was just standing there." The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the small group of onlookers began to grow. Some stared silently, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Others whispered among themselves, shaking their heads. From the corner of his eye, Ryan caught sight of a woman holding her phone up, pointing it directly at him. He felt a twinge of discomfort, but kept moving, gripping Darnell's arm a little tighter. As he opened the patrol car door, the murmurs turned into a low rumble. The weight of their stares bore down on him, heavy and inescapable. "Hey, officer!" someone called out. "What did he even do?" Ryan stiffened. He didn't respond, didn't turn around. He focused on getting Darnell into the car, shutting the door with more force than necessary. He turned back toward the crowd, his eyes briefly meeting theirs. Their expressions were clear: disapproval, anger, and a silent accusation. "This isn't right." Ryan felt his chest tighten. For a moment he wondered if they were right, if maybe, just maybe, he'd misjudged the situation. But then the voice of Sergeant Thompson echoed in his mind. "Don't hesitate. People need to see you're in control." He straightened his shoulders, masking his unease. Inwardly he justified his actions. "I'm doing my job. They don't know the full story." But deep down, the doubt lingered. Meanwhile, the video taken by the woman had already started to spread. Within hours, it would find its way onto social media, where it would ignite a firestorm of outrage. Strangers would share it, comment on it, dissect every second of it. And for the first time, Ryan Mitchell would become a name people remembered, not as a protector of justice, but as a symbol of something far more troubling. The crowd dispersed slowly, their murmurs fading into the background. But the weight of their eyes stayed with Ryan long after they were gone. He told himself he didn't care. But part of him knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. The patrol car door slammed shut with a heavy finality, and for Darnell Washington, the world seemed to blur. His hands, cold and confined by the metal cuffs, rested awkwardly behind his back. He sat rigidly, staring at the dashboard, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to ask why, to demand an explanation. But every time the words formed in his throat, they caught on something: fear, frustration, disbelief. From the corner of his eye, Darnell saw the officer standing outside, speaking briefly into his radio. He wasn't yelling, wasn't agitated. He was calm, methodical. like this was just another routine arrest. But for Darnell, nothing about this felt routine. His mind raced, replaying the moments before the arrest over and over again. I was just standing there. I didn't do anything wrong. How did it come to this? He thought of his family, his mother, his sister, his nieces and nephews. He pictured their faces if they could see him now, trapped in the back seat of a patrol car, the weight of an accusation he didn't deserve pressing down on him. Darnell's chest tightened as the reality of his situation sank in. His eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Not the officer, not the strangers who had watched in silence, not anyone. But he couldn't hide the pain in his eyes. As the car began to move, he turned to look out the window, catching a glimpse of his reflection. His face was etched with something he didn't want to acknowledge. Hurt, humiliation, and a question that wouldn't leave him. Why me? The street lights blurred as the car drove on, and Darnell sat motionless. On the surface, he looked calm, but inside, he felt like he was breaking apart. What more could I have done? I follow the rules. I live a good life. Isn't that enough? For Darnell, this wasn't just about an arrest. It was a crack in the foundation of everything he believed, that if you do everything right, you'll be safe. But now, he wasn't so sure. And as the patrol car carried him further from the life he knew, one thought consumed him. I did nothing wrong, and still, here I am. The courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation. Ryan Mitchell sat at the defense table, his uniform crisp but his confidence fraying at the edges. Across the room, Judge Marcus Carter adjusted his glasses, his expression steady, unreadable. Judge Carter was a man who carried the weight of justice with a calm authority. He wasn't loud, nor was he theatrical. But his words had a way of cutting through the noise, reaching places that most people wanted to avoid. Today, his focus was on Ryan. Officer Mitchell, Carter began, his voice measured, when you put on that badge, who were you protecting? The question landed like a stone in a still pond, its ripples reverberating through the courtroom. Ryan opened his mouth, his instinct to defend himself taking over. I was doing my job, Your Honor, he said, his tone steady but tinged with unease. I was following protocol. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp. And what protocol told you to arrest a man who wasn't resisting? To ignore his explanation? To escalate a situation that didn't need escalating? Ryan hesitated. His mind raced back to that day. The call, the crowd, Darnell's face as he was cuffed and led to the car. The words he had rehearsed felt distant now, hollow against the weight of Carter's questions. Your Honor, I acted on the information I had at the time, Ryan replied, his voice quieter now. Carter nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Ryan. And that information? What was it based on? A vague call? A gut feeling? Or perhaps, he paused, his voice dropping slightly, on a lesson you learned from someone who thought suspicion was enough to destroy a life? Ryan flinched. The words struck deeper than he expected. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. The video of Darnell's arrest, the call logs showing no credible source, and witness statements painting a clear picture of an overreach of authority. Ryan watched as the truth unfolded in front of him, each piece of evidence chipping away at the certainty he had clung to. At first, he had believed he was in the right, that he was doing his duty. But now, faced with the stark reality of what his actions had done, doubt began to creep in. It started as a whisper in the back of his mind and grew louder with every word spoken in the courtroom. Carter's voice broke through his thoughts. Officer Mitchell, justice isn't about power. It's about fairness. Somewhere along the way, you forgot that. So I'll ask you again. When you put on that badge, who were you protecting? Ryan looked around the room, at Darnell sitting silently with his family, at the spectators watching intently, and at his fellow officers, some of whom avoided his gaze. His throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to justify himself. But deep down, he knew the truth. Judge Carter leaned back, his tone softening slightly. Every action we take has consequences. Your decision didn't just affect you, it shattered another man's life. The question is, Officer Mitchell, will you own up to that, or will you continue to hide behind your badge? Ryan's hands gripped the edge of the table. His mind raced, but for the first time, no words came. He lowered his head, the weight of his silence speaking louder than any defense he could have offered. And in that moment, Ryan Mitchell wasn't just facing Judge Carter. he was facing himself. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the prosecution continued to lay out its case. Piece by piece, the layers of truth were peeled back, revealing a darkness that stretched far beyond a single arrest. This call, the prosecutor began, holding up a printed record, was placed from a payphone that hasn't been in service for years. The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Judge Carter's brow furrowed, his expression hardening. "Are you saying the report was falsified?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied. "The report was fabricated to justify Officer Mitchell's response, but the issue doesn't stop there." The room fell silent as the prosecutor advanced to the next slide on the screen. It was a series of documents, internal memos, training manuals, and notes from closed-door meetings. "This," the prosecutor said, his voice steady, "is a glimpse into a system designed not to protect but to control. These materials show how officers were trained to identify so-called threats based on little more than appearance. They were taught to escalate situations, to use force as a first resort rather than a last." Ryan's stomach churned. He recognized some of the phrases, words he had heard during his training, slipped into conversations by senior officers, repeated until they felt like second nature. Don't wait for them to make a move. You act first. If you hesitate, you lose control. Respect is something you take, not something you earn. It had all seemed like wisdom back then, advice from experienced officers who knew how things worked. But now, seeing it laid out like this, Ryan felt the ground beneath him shift. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, his voice rising slightly. "This is not about one officer's mistake. This is about a system, a network, that has turned authority into a weapon. Officers were taught to manipulate reports, to bend the truth, and to protect each other at all costs." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The words network and manipulation struck a chord. It wasn't just Ryan on trial, it was the culture he had been a part of. The prosecutor continued, pointing to a diagram on the screen. "These are the officers involved in this network. They shared tactics, falsified evidence, and protected each other from accountability. And their influence extended far beyond this precinct." Ryan's mind raced. Faces flashed through his memory. Sergeant Thompson, the veteran officers in the break room, the ones who had told him to act first and ask questions later. Had they all been part of this? Judge Carter's voice broke through the rising murmur. "Order in the court." His tone was calm, but it carried the weight of authority. "Continue." The prosecutor nodded. "Your Honor, this case is about more than Darnell, Washington. It's about exposing a system that has failed the very people it was meant to serve. And today, we begin that process by holding those responsible accountable." Ryan sat frozen, the weight of the revelations pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a bad decision or a moment of poor judgment. It was about something much bigger, something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. And now it was all unraveling. The courtroom grew quiet as Darnell Washington stood, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His voice, steady but filled with emotion, broke the silence. "Your Honor," he began, glancing briefly at the jury, "I never thought something like this would happen to me. I always believed that if I followed the rules, worked hard, and treated people with respect, I'd be safe." He paused, his gaze falling to his hands. "But that day, standing outside that store, everything I thought I knew about fairness and justice shattered." The room hung on his every word. Darnell took a deep breath, his voice faltering slightly. "When that officer approached me, I thought it was a mistake. I tried to explain. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But he didn't listen. He didn't even look at me, not really. To him, I wasn't a person. I was a problem he needed to solve." He looked up, his eyes meeting the jury. "Do you know what it's like to feel invisible, and yet so exposed at the same time? To have people watching you, judging you, and no one stepping in to help?" A murmur of sympathy rippled through the gallery. Darnell's voice grew softer, tinged with pain. "The worst part wasn't even being arrested. It was having to explain to my nieces and nephews why their uncle was in handcuffs. Why the man they look up to, the one who helps them with homework and takes them to the park, was treated like a criminal." He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes glistening. "How do you tell a child that sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough? That no matter how kind you are, how hard you work, or how much you try, some people will see you as less than human. Judge Carter's face remained composed, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep understanding of what Darnell was saying. Darnell took a shaky breath, steadying himself. This isn't just about me. It's about what happens every day to people who look like me, people who are judged before they even open their mouths, people who have to carry a weight they didn't ask for. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking into everyone present. As he stepped down, Darnell turned to the judge one last time. Your Honor, I'm not here because I want revenge. I'm here because I want my nieces and nephews to grow up in a world where they don't have to ask, why did this happen to Uncle Darnell? I just want them to be safe. And with that, Darnell sat down, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if he had just set down a heavy burden. But the weight of his words lingered, echoing in the minds of everyone in that room. For a moment, no one spoke, and then the trial continued, but the room felt different, as if everyone present had been forced to confront a truth they could no longer ignore. Ryan Mitchell sat at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the polished wood surface in front of him. He had avoided looking at Darnell for most of the trial, but now, as the testimony wrapped up, something made him glance toward the gallery. That's when he saw her, Darnell's mother. She sat in the second row, her hands clutching a tissue, her shoulders trembling slightly. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to remain composed, but the grief was unmistakable. Ryan's chest tightened. It wasn't anger in her expression, it was heartbreak. For the first time, the weight of what he had done truly hit him. This wasn't just about a report or an arrest. This wasn't a small mistake. This was a family, a life, a trust shattered by his actions. His thoughts spiraled. He could still hear Darnell's quiet words from the stand. How do you tell a child that sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough? The question echoed in his mind, louder and louder until it was deafening. Ryan's hands clenched into fists under the table. I was following orders, he told himself. I was just doing my job. But the excuses felt hollow now, meaningless in the face of the pain he had caused. Judge Marcus Carter's voice broke through his thoughts, firm but calm. Officer Mitchell, he began, his gaze piercing. What did you write in your report that day? Did you state that Mr. Washington was resisting arrest? That he posed a threat? Ryan's throat tightened. He nodded faintly. And do you believe that now? Carter pressed. Do you truly believe sitting here today that Darnell Washington was a threat to you or to anyone? The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on Ryan. His mind raced back to that day. The way Darnell had stood quietly, hands raised, confusion on his face. He remembered the way he had ignored the man's words, his explanations, because in his mind he had already decided. Ryan swallowed hard, the knot in his stomach twisting tighter. For weeks he had convinced himself that he was right, that his actions were justified. But now, with the truth laid bare, he couldn't escape it anymore. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, his voice softer, but no less commanding. When you wrote that report, Officer Mitchell, did you truly believe what you wrote? Or did you write what you thought you had to protect yourself? Ryan's breath caught. His pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to defend himself, to justify his actions, but he couldn't find the words. The truth loomed over him, undeniable and unforgiving. He looked back at Darnell's mother, still silently crying in the gallery. Her tears weren't just for her son. They were for every mother who had watched their child endure injustice. Ryan's shoulders slumped, and his gaze fell back to the table. The silence in the room grew heavier, pressing down on him like a physical weight. For the first time, Ryan Mitchell couldn't escape the truth. This wasn't just about protocol or training or even the system he had been a part of. This was about him. And it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. The room was unbearably quiet. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Ryan Mitchell, waiting for his answer. His heart pounded in his chest, his palms damp as they gripped the edge of the table. Judge Carter's question lingered in the air. Did you believe what you wrote in that report? Or did you write it to protect yourself? Ryan's throat tightened. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him, not just from the people in the courtroom, but from himself. For weeks, he had clung to his defenses, to the idea that he had only been doing his job. But now, under the unforgiving glare of the truth, he couldn't hold on to the lie any longer. He took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, Your Honor, I didn't believe it." Gasps rippled through the room. Darnell's mother raised a hand to her mouth, her tears flowing freely now. The gallery seemed to shift, the weight of Ryan's words settling on everyone present. Judge Carter leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Then why, Officer Mitchell? Why did you write it?" Ryan hesitated. The words stuck in his throat, but he forced them out. "Because that's what I was taught to do. That's what the system expects. Act first, write the report to match later." His voice cracked, the vulnerability in his tone cutting through the room. He paused, glancing around the courtroom, his eyes landing on Darnell. "I didn't see you, Mr. Washington," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't see a man who was just standing there. I saw what I was trained to see, a threat. And I was wrong." The weight of the admission hit him harder than he expected. His chest felt tight, but for the first time in weeks, he felt something else. Clarity. "I let my ambition, my need to prove myself, blind me," he continued, looking down at the table. "And I let myself be influenced by a system that doesn't value justice, only control. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I wasn't." The silence in the room was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of Ryan's words, with the realization that a man who had once wielded power without question was finally questioning himself. Judge Carter sat back, his face softening slightly. "It takes courage to admit that, Officer Mitchell, but courage doesn't erase consequences." Ryan nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I understand, Your Honor. I just want to make it right." In that moment, Ryan wasn't a man in uniform. He wasn't a symbol of authority or a product of a corrupt system. He was simply a man, a flawed, broken man, taking his first step toward accountability. And for the first time, Ryan Mitchell felt the weight of his badge lift. Not because he was absolved, but because he finally understood what it meant to truly serve justice. The courtroom wasn't just a stage for Ryan's admission. It became the catalyst for something much larger. Judge Marcus Carter, a man who had long fought against the cracks in the justice system, seized the moment to confront the deeper rot that lay beneath. "This trial is not just about one officer's actions," Carter declared, his voice firm and resonant. "It's about a culture that has allowed corruption to fester unchecked. Today, that changes." He signed an order to launch a full-scale investigation into the Metropolitan Police Department. The directive was clear. No stone would be left unturned. Every complaint, every report, every questionable arrest would be scrutinized. Officers implicated in the corruption network would be brought to justice, no matter how high their rank. The revelations that followed sent shockwaves through the city. Documents and testimonies unveiled years of systemic abuse, fabricated reports, buried evidence, and a pattern of targeting vulnerable communities. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was the tree itself, its roots tangled with deceit and power. News of the investigation spread quickly. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, their signs demanding accountability and justice. Families who had long been silenced by fear now came forward, their voices adding weight to the growing call for change. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers who had turned a blind eye to misconduct for years now found themselves under scrutiny. Some resigned quietly. Others fought to defend their actions, only to find themselves named in the investigation. Judge Carter didn't stop at accountability. He pushed for reform. "This department needs more than punishment," he said during a press conference. "It needs transformation." Mandatory retraining programs were introduced, focusing on de-escalation tactics, implicit bias awareness, and community engagement. Body camera footage would now be stored on independent servers, ensuring it couldn't be tampered with. Civilian oversight committees were established to review complaints and hold officers accountable. The changes weren't easy. Resistance came from within, as many officers clung to the old ways, but the momentum was undeniable. The weight of public outrage, combined with Judge Carter's relentless pursuit of justice, ensured that progress couldn't be ignored. For the first time in decades, the community began to see glimpses of hope. The fall of the corrupt network wasn't just a reckoning. It was an opportunity to rebuild something better. And while the scars of the past couldn't be erased, they served as a reminder of what had been lost. and what could never be allowed to happen again. The system hadn't just failed, it had been broken. But now, under the harsh light of truth, it was being pieced back together, not as a weapon of control, but as a beacon of justice. Ryan Mitchell sat alone in the precinct's locker room, his badge resting in his palm. The metal once felt heavy with pride, but now it weighed him down with shame. He stared at it, tracing the numbers engraved on its surface, knowing what he had to do. The next morning, Ryan stood before his superiors. His voice was steady, but the pain in his eyes betrayed his emotions. "I can't wear this anymore," he said, placing the badge on the table. "Not until I've made things right." It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the first step toward redemption. That same day, Ryan walked into the community center where Darnell and his family had gathered for a meeting. The air was heavy with tension as he entered the room, his presence drawing quiet stares and murmurs. He cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Washington," he began, looking directly at Darnell. "I came here today to say something I should have said a long time ago. I'm sorry." Ryan's voice cracked as he continued. "I'm sorry for not listening to you. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you and your family. I see now that my actions didn't just hurt you. They betrayed everything this badge was supposed to stand for." Darnell's mother wiped a tear from her cheek, her expression softening slightly. Darnell nodded, his face calm but guarded. "Words are a start," he said quietly, "but actions matter more." Ryan took those words to heart. He didn't just walk away from his badge, he walked into a mission. He began working with local organizations focused on police reform, sharing his story with young recruits and seasoned officers alike. Standing in front of packed rooms, he recounted his journey, his ambition, his mistakes, and the lessons he had learned the hard way. "There's a difference between authority and trust," he would say. "One can be taken, but the other must be earned. And if you're not careful, you'll lose both." His words resonated deeply, especially with young officers who were just starting their careers. Ryan's vulnerability, his willingness to admit his failures, inspired them to think differently about their roles. He also became an advocate for community engagement, helping bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. Ryan worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, one conversation at a time. Over time, Ryan's efforts began to make a difference. He wasn't seeking forgiveness. He knew that wasn't his to demand. But he was determined to make sure that no one else would go through what Darnell had endured. And in his journey to right his wrongs, Ryan found a new purpose, not in enforcing the law, but in ensuring that justice was something everyone could believe in. It wasn't redemption he was chasing. It was change. The courtroom was filled with a solemn silence as Judge Marcus Carter prepared to deliver his final statement. He removed his glasses, placing them carefully on the desk, and looked out at the room. His gaze swept over Ryan Mitchell, Darnell Washington, their families, and the community members seated in the gallery. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but layered with emotion. "Today, we have seen justice begin to take shape. But justice is not simply about exposing those who have done wrong. It is about creating a system where wrongdoing has no place to hide." The weight of his words pressed on the room, drawing everyone's attention. Mr. Mitchell's admission and the revelations of corruption have given us the chance to confront a broken system. But we cannot stop here, Carter continued. True justice isn't about punishing individuals. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure the pain, the fear, and the loss we've heard about in this trial. He paused, his voice softening yet firm with conviction. Courage isn't just standing up against what's wrong. It's building something better in its place. We must be relentless in our pursuit of a system that values fairness over power, compassion over control, and integrity above all else. The gallery was silent, but the energy in the room was palpable. Judge Carter turned his attention to Darnell, his family, and the countless others affected by the system's failures. To those who have suffered, I cannot undo the harm that has been done. But I can promise you this: we will not stop until this system is reformed, until justice becomes a reality for everyone, not just a promise. He then addressed the officers in attendance. To those who wear the badge, remember that it is not a symbol of authority. It is a symbol of responsibility. Every action you take ripples through lives, and it is your duty to ensure that those ripples bring safety and trust, not fear and destruction. Finally, he looked back at Ryan. Mr. Mitchell, your story is a reminder that we are all capable of change, but change requires accountability. You've taken the first step by facing the truth. Now, it's up to you to continue walking the path of redemption, and to help others see it too. As Judge Carter concluded, the room felt different. Lighter, yet more determined. People filed out quietly, but their minds buzzed with his words. Outside the courthouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd. Protest signs now seemed less like demands and more like promises. Conversations sparked among strangers, filled with hope and resolve. For Darnell, his family, and even Ryan, the journey wasn't over. But for the first time, it felt like the beginning of something better. And for everyone who heard Judge Carter's words, one thing was clear. Change was no longer just a hope. It was a responsibility. As the courthouse doors closed behind him, Carter's voice echoed in their hearts. Justice isn't just about what we fight against, it's about what we fight for. Thank you for watching this powerful story about justice, redemption, and the courage to create change. If this story moved you or made you think differently, we'd love for you to take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support means the world to us. Every like, share, and subscription gives our team the motivation to continue creating meaningful content that inspires, educates, and connects us all. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that could change your perspective or touch your heart. Together, we can amplify these important messages and keep building a better world, one story at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.